A woman knows her marriage is over the moment another man notices the tears her husband never saw. The crystal chandeliers above the ballroom glowed like melted gold, reflecting across champagne glasses and marble floors polished so perfectly they mirrored every designer heel in the room. The annual Crawford Foundation Gala was the kind of Manhattan event people waited months to be invited to, where billionaires shook hands beside politicians and every smile looked expensive. And in the center of it all stood Claire Crawford in a silver satin gown, beautiful enough to stop conversations, yet somehow completely invisible to the one man she wanted to see her. Ethan Crawford stood barely 20 feet away, surrounded by investors, his deep navy tuxedo sharp against the warm lights of the ballroom. He looked exactly like the magazines described him. Powerful, untouchable, cold. His voice remained calm as he discussed a billion-dollar merger while Claire stood alone beside the stage, fingers tightening around the stem of her untouched champagne glass. She had spent nearly 3 hours preparing for tonight. The gown, the makeup, the diamond earrings Ethan's assistant picked out because Ethan himself never noticed those things. Yet he hadn't looked at her once since they arrived. Not really. "Sir, one photo with your wife?" a photographer suddenly asked with a practiced smile. Ethan glanced briefly toward Claire before checking his watch. "Later," he answered flatly before turning back to the investors beside him. Claire felt the familiar ache settle quietly into her chest. Not anger anymore, just exhaustion. Around her, laughter echoed through the ballroom, while waiters carried silver trays filled with lobster bites and champagne that cost more than her father used to make in a week at his bookstore in Vermont. Sometimes she still couldn't believe this was her life now. 6 months ago, she was helping customers find used novels and balancing unpaid bills at the kitchen table. Now she lived in a $40 million penthouse overlooking Central Park. And somehow she had never felt lonelier. She lowered her eyes, pretending to adjust the delicate silver bracelet wrapped around her wrist. Her mother's bracelet. The only piece of her old life she still carried everywhere. Ethan had never once asked about it. Not once. The orchestra shifted into a softer melody as couples slowly moved toward the dance floor. Claire watched them quietly. Men placing careful hands on their wives' backs. Women laughing softly beneath the golden lights. Small touches. Small moments. The kind of intimacy that somehow felt more luxurious than anything in this room. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." The voice startled her gently. Claire turned to find a tall man beside her, maybe early 40s, with dark hair touched slightly with gray and kind eyes that didn't immediately scan her jewelry or dress. "I'm Adrian Cole," he said, offering his hand politely. "Ethan's newest business partner." Claire forced a soft smile. "Claire Crawford." Adrian's expression shifted almost immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "I just don't think anyone's asked how you're doing tonight." For a second, Claire forgot how to answer, because no one had asked her that in a very long time. Across the ballroom, Ethan finally looked up from his conversation. His eyes landed briefly on Claire laughing softly at something Adrian whispered beside her. And for the first time that entire evening, Ethan Crawford stopped talking mid-sentence. The music swelled softly through the ballroom, but Ethan Crawford no longer heard a single word from the investors standing around him. His attention stayed fixed on Claire across the room. It irritated him immediately, not because she was speaking to Adrian Cole, because she was smiling. A real smile. The kind he had not seen since the day they signed the marriage agreement 6 months earlier. Ethan loosened his jaw slightly, trying to focus on the conversation around him, but Adrian leaned closer to Claire again, saying something that made her laugh quietly beneath the chandelier light. The sound carried farther than it should have. "Ethan," one of the board members asked carefully, "are you still with us?" Ethan blinked once. "Reschedule the Singapore call for tomorrow," he answered, flatly before walking away without another explanation. On the other side of the ballroom, Claire was beginning to regret the second glass of champagne she barely touched. Her heels hurt. Her shoulders ached from pretending everything was fine. But Adrian somehow made the room easier to survive. "You do not like these events very much, do you?" he asked gently. Claire gave a soft laugh. "Is it that obvious?" Only to someone paying attention. The words landed harder than he intended. Claire looked down briefly at the silver bracelet on her wrist. "You are very observant, Mr. Cole." "Adrian," he corrected kindly. "And you can call me a recovering workaholic." She smiled again despite herself. Across the room, Ethan stopped near the bar, his expression unreadable as he watched them. The bartender carefully slid a fresh whiskey toward him, but Ethan barely touched it. Instead, his eyes stayed on Claire while memories he had ignored for months suddenly returned in sharp fragments. Claire waiting by the penthouse windows at midnight with dinner still warm. Claire falling asleep on the living room couch with a book in her lap because he canceled another anniversary dinner. Claire quietly covering him with a blanket one night after he passed out in his office chair. He had noticed all of it. He just never allowed himself to care. Caring complicated things. Their marriage had always been an obligation. A promise between families. Nothing more. At least that was what he kept telling himself. You know, Adrian said carefully, lowering his voice. People spend all night trying to impress your husband. But he is the one with the most impressive woman in the room. Claire looked startled by the sincerity in his tone. That is a dangerous thing to say at a billionaire's gala. Adrian smiled faintly. Then maybe billionaires should pay closer attention. Before Claire could answer, the orchestra suddenly shifted into a slow classical melody as couples moved toward the center dance floor. Around them, crystal lights shimmered against polished marble while cameras flashed near the stage. Adrian offered his hand politely. May I have this dance? Claire froze for half a second. She instinctively looked toward Ethan. He stood at the far end of the ballroom, one hand resting against the bar, eyes locked directly onto hers. Cold, intense, impossible to read. And for the first time all evening, Claire felt something dangerous flicker beneath his silence. Claire stared at Adrian's outstretched hand while the orchestra filled the ballroom with a slow piano melody soft enough to make the entire room feel suspended in time. Around them, couples drifted toward the dance floor beneath the warm chandelier light, their reflections shimmering across polished marble like scenes from old Hollywood films. For one dangerous second, Claire almost forgot Ethan was watching. Adrian's expression remained calm, respectful, patient, not demanding, not possessive, just kind. It had been so long since someone looked at her like she mattered that the simple gesture nearly unraveled her completely. It is just one dance, Adrian said softly, noticing her hesitation. Claire let out a quiet breath and placed her hand in his. Across the ballroom, Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. The movement was small, almost invisible, but the investor beside him noticed it anyway. Everything all right? The man asked carefully. Ethan did not answer. His eyes stayed fixed on Claire as Adrian guided her gently toward the center of the ballroom. The moment the other man's hand settled lightly against Claire's back, something unfamiliar twisted sharply inside Ethan's chest. Jealousy was not an emotion he entertained. He controlled companies, markets, negotiations. Emotions complicated judgment. Yet watching Claire look relaxed beside another man made him irrationally angry in a way he could not explain. On the dance floor, Claire tried to ignore the tension she felt from across the room. Adrian noticed immediately. You keep looking over your shoulder, he murmured. Habit, Claire admitted quietly. That bad? She forced a small smile. You do not become Mrs. Ethan Crawford by accident. Adrian studied her expression carefully. And are you happy being her? The question caught her completely off guard. Claire looked away as the music slowed around them. For a moment, she remembered the first week inside Ethan's penthouse. The massive windows overlooking Manhattan. The silence. The untouched grand piano in the corner covered by a thin layer of dust. The way she used to leave the dining room light on past midnight waiting for Ethan to come home. Most nights he never did. I think, she whispered finally. Sometimes people get so used to surviving beside someone that they stop asking whether they are loved. Adrian's expression softened. And does Ethan love you? Claire almost laughed at the question, but the sound caught painfully in her throat before it could escape. Ethan respects loyalty, she answered carefully. That is not what I asked. Before Claire could respond, applause suddenly echoed through the ballroom as one of the foundation board members stepped onto the stage to announce the annual donor presentation. Couples slowly separated while waiters moved gracefully between tables refilling crystal glasses. Adrian released Claire's hand immediately, gentlemanly as ever. Thank you for the dance, he said warmly. Claire nodded politely, but before she could step away, the heel of her silver dress caught slightly against the edge of the marble floor. Her balance shifted fast. Instinctively, Adrian reached forward, catching her hand firmly before she could stumble. The touch lasted barely 2 seconds. But across the ballroom, Ethan saw all of it. Adrian's fingers wrapped around Claire's hand, Claire looking up at him with startled eyes. The closeness between them beneath the golden lights. Ethan's whiskey glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor with a sharp crack loud enough to silence nearby conversations instantly. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed across the ballroom so suddenly that conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned instantly toward the bar where crystal shards glittered across the marble floor beside Ethan Crawford's polished shoes. For a moment, nobody moved. Ethan stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable, but the tension radiating from him changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Claire felt her stomach tighten immediately. Adrian slowly released her hand, sensing the shift before anyone said a word. "Mr. Crawford," one of the board members called carefully, stepping closer. "Are you all right?" Ethan never looked away from Claire. "Fine," he answered coldly. A staff member rushed forward to clean the broken glass, but Ethan had already started walking across the ballroom. Slow, controlled, dangerous in the quietest possible way. Claire suddenly felt exposed beneath the chandeliers, every camera in the room subtly turning toward them. She hated this feeling. The attention, the whispers that always followed wealthy people pretending to love each other in public. Ethan stopped directly in front of her, towering tall in his dark tuxedo, his eyes colder than she had ever seen them. "We are leaving," he said flatly. Claire blinked in surprise. "The presentation has not even started." "Now, Claire." Adrian stepped back politely, immediately understanding he was standing in the center of something much deeper than jealousy. "I should probably speak with the board anyway," he said calmly, trying to ease the tension. Ethan barely acknowledged him. That hurt Claire more than it should have. Adrian had shown her more kindness in one evening than Ethan had shown her in months, and somehow Ethan still looked at him like an inconvenience instead of a person. "I am staying," Claire said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened almost instantly. "You are my wife." The words landed heavily between them. Claire stared at him in disbelief because suddenly, after months of silence, after months of empty dinners and forgotten conversations and lonely nights in a penthouse that never felt like home, Ethan finally remembered that fact now, in front of everyone. "Interesting timing," she whispered. Ethan stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. "This is not the place." "No," Claire answered softly, her eyes beginning to shine beneath the ballroom lights. "The place was every night I waited for you to come home." Ethan looked stunned for half a second. Claire rarely challenged him publicly, rarely challenged him at all. But tonight something inside her felt exhausted beyond repair. Around them, the orchestra continued playing softly as guests pretended not to stare. The humiliation of private pain becoming public settled heavily in Claire's chest. "Claire," Ethan said more quietly this time, "you are overreacting." She almost laughed at that. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes for the first time all evening. "Am I?" Her voice trembled slightly despite her effort to stay calm. "You ignored me for months, Ethan. You barely looked at me tonight until another man held my hand for 2 seconds." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Because she was right, and they both knew it. The silence between them stretched painfully long before Claire finally took a small step backward. "I am tired," she whispered. "Not of this gala, not of the cameras, of feeling invisible beside my own husband." Then, before Ethan could stop her, Claire turned and walked away through the golden ballroom alone while hundreds of people silently watched the most powerful billionaire in Manhattan stand there looking like a man who had just realized he was losing something money could never replace. The cold Manhattan air hit Claire the second she stepped outside the hotel, sharp against her bare shoulders despite the Blacktown car already waiting near the curb. Behind her, the glowing ballroom windows still shimmered with wealth and music, and people pretending not to gossip about what they had just witnessed. Claire wrapped her arms tightly around herself, trying to steady the ache building inside her chest. For months she had convinced herself she could survive this marriage as long as she expected nothing. No affection, no attention, no love. Expectations were dangerous. But tonight Ethan had looked at her with something she had never seen before, and somehow that hurt even more. The hotel doors opened again behind her. "Mrs. Crawford." Claire turned slightly as Adrian stepped outside, holding her silver shawl carefully in one hand. You forgot this. She blinked in surprise before accepting it quietly. Thank you. Adrian studied her expression for a moment, concern softening his features beneath the city lights. I apologize if tonight caused problems between you and your husband. Claire let out a tired laugh. Tonight did not create the problem. A black SUV rolled slowly past the hotel entrance while snowflakes began drifting lightly through the Manhattan streets. Adrian hesitated before speaking again. For what it is worth, Claire, I think you deserve to be loved loudly, not quietly tolerated. The words settled deeply inside her before she could stop them. Claire looked down for a second, fighting the sting behind her eyes. Good night, Adrian. Good night. He stepped back respectfully as her driver opened the car door. Claire slipped inside the warm leather interior and leaned her head gently against the window as the city lights blurred outside. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors opened directly into the Crawford penthouse. Silence greeted her immediately. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan like glowing pieces of gold scattered beneath the dark sky. But tonight the apartment felt colder than ever. Claire slowly removed her heels near the doorway, rubbing her sore feet against the marble floor. The untouched grand piano still sat near the windows exactly where it always had, covered in silence and dust. She walked toward the dining room and stopped. 2 plates still rested on the long oak table from the dinner she had asked the staff to prepare before the gala. One untouched, one never used. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Even after everything, part of her still hoped Ethan might sit with her for one normal meal someday. She hated herself a little for still wanting that. Her phone buzzed softly in her clutch purse. A message from Ethan. Where are you? Claire stared at the screen in disbelief before laughing quietly to herself. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. 6 months of emotional distance. 6 months of unanswered dinners, canceled plans, and conversations that felt more like business meetings than marriage. And suddenly now he noticed her absence. Another message appeared seconds later. We need to talk. Claire placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter without answering. Then she walked slowly toward the living room where a single lamp still glowed beside the couch. Her blanket rested, folded neatly where she always left it after waiting up for Ethan night after night. Sometimes she fell asleep there until 2 or 3 in the morning, just hoping to hear the elevator doors open. Ethan probably never even realized it. Claire sat down quietly and looked around the enormous penthouse that every magazine in New York called a dream home. Somehow it had never once felt like hers. Her eyes drifted toward the silver bracelet around her wrist. Her mother used to say, "The loneliest place in the world is beside someone who makes you feel unseen." Claire used to think that sounded dramatic. Now she understood exactly what it meant. Then suddenly the private elevator doors opened behind her. Claire did not turn around immediately when the elevator doors slid open behind her. Somehow she already knew it was Ethan. She could feel his presence before he even spoke, heavy and tense against the silence of the penthouse. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Manhattan glowed outside the windows while soft snow continued falling beyond the glass, turning the city into blurred silver and gold. Ethan loosened his bow tie slowly, his movements controlled but sharper than usual. You left without security, he said finally. Claire almost smiled at that. Not because it was sweet, because concern was apparently easier for Ethan than affection. I took the driver, she answered quietly without looking at him. Ethan stared at her sitting alone on the couch wrapped in silence, and suddenly noticed details he had ignored for months. Her heels abandoned near the doorway, the faint redness around her eyes, the untouched dinner still sitting cold on the table, things that had always been there, things he had simply stopped seeing. Claire, his voice softened slightly. Look at me. Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Ethan felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest the second he saw her expression. Not anger. That would have been easier. She looked tired, deeply tired, like someone who had spent too long carrying disappointment quietly. Ethan stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing faintly across the marble floor. What happened tonight was inappropriate. Claire blinked at him in disbelief. That is what you want to talk about? Ethan's jaw tightened. Another man touching my wife in front of half of Manhattan is absolutely something we need to discuss. Claire let out a soft laugh that sounded painfully close to breaking. Your wife? She repeated quietly. Interesting. You barely spoke to me for 6 months, Ethan, but suddenly now I am your wife again. Ethan looked away briefly, frustrated because every word she said landed harder than he expected. You know what I mean. No, Claire answered immediately. I honestly do not. She stood slowly from the couch, holding the silver shawl tighter around herself. Tell me something honestly. If Adrian had not touched my hand tonight, would you have noticed me at all? Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because he did not know. The silence between them became unbearable. Claire nodded softly like she had just received the answer anyway. That is what I thought. She turned toward the kitchen, trying to create distance before her emotions betrayed her completely, but Ethan spoke again before she could walk away. You embarrassed me tonight. Claire froze instantly. The words settled into the room like ice. Slowly, she turned back toward him, hurt flashing openly across her face for the first time all evening. I embarrassed you. Her voice trembled now despite every effort to stay calm. Ethan, I have spent 6 months eating dinner alone in this apartment while defending you to everyone around me. I stood beside you at every event, smiled for every camera, learned how to fit into your world even when it made me feel invisible. Her eyes filled despite herself, and somehow the only thing you noticed was another man being kind to me for 10 seconds. Ethan stared at her speechless, because she was right again. The worst part was realizing he remembered every single thing she mentioned. The dinners, the waiting, the quiet effort she made every day to make this marriage feel real while he treated it like another obligation on his calendar. Claire looked down at the silver bracelet around her wrist before whispering softly. Do you know what hurts the most? Ethan said nothing. I do not even think you mean to hurt me anymore. The honesty in her voice shattered something inside him far more deeply than anger ever could. The penthouse fell completely silent after Claire's words, the kind of silence that felt heavier than shouting. Ethan stood motionless near the dining table, staring at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time and realizing how much damage had quietly accumulated between them. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly across Manhattan while the city lights flickered beneath the dark sky, but inside the apartment everything suddenly felt painfully still. Claire wiped quickly beneath her eyes before the tears could fully fall. She hated crying in front of him. Not because Ethan was cruel. Somehow that would have been easier to understand. The hardest part was that he could stand inches away from her and still feel emotionally unreachable. Ethan finally stepped forward again, his voice lower now. Claire, I did not realize things had gotten this bad. The second the words left his mouth, regret crossed his face because even he heard how terrible they sounded. Claire stared at him in disbelief. You did not realize, she whispered softly. Ethan, I stopped asking you to come to bed 3 months ago because I got tired of hearing you say you were busy. Ethan's expression tightened. Claire continued before she lost the courage. I learned your coffee order. I memorized your schedule. I defended you every time people said you were cold because I thought maybe underneath all of this you were just lonely. Her voice cracked slightly. But loneliness does not make someone forget another person exists. Ethan looked away sharply, running one hand through his hair in frustration. He wanted to argue, wanted to explain the pressure, the business deals, the responsibilities that consumed every hour of his life. But none of it sounded important anymore, standing in front of her pain. Claire took a slow breath before speaking again. Do you know what Adrian did tonight that affected you so much? Ethan's eyes lifted back toward hers immediately. He noticed me. The words landed directly in the center of Ethan's chest. Claire laughed softly through the tears, threatening her voice. That is all it took. He noticed my shoes were hurting me. He noticed I was anxious in the crowd. He asked if I was happy. Ethan swallowed hard. Because he had not asked Claire if she was happy once since they got married. Not once. Claire slowly removed the silver bracelet from her wrist, holding it carefully in her palm. My mother gave me this before she died, she said quietly. She told me never to stay anywhere I had to beg to be loved. Ethan stared at the bracelet for a long moment. Claire. But I stayed anyway, she whispered. Because every once in a while you would look at me for half a second, and I would convince myself there was something real underneath all your walls. Her eyes finally met his fully again. Tonight was the first time I realized maybe I imagined all of it. Ethan felt panic rise unexpectedly inside him at the thought of her truly giving up. It shocked him how immediate the fear was. Real. Physical. He stepped closer instinctively. You are not imagining things. Claire shook her head slowly. Then tell me honestly. Her voice barely rose above a whisper now. If another man had not touched my hand tonight, would you have fought for me at all? Ethan opened his mouth to answer immediately, but no words came. Because for the first time in his life, the billionaire who controlled every room he entered suddenly faced the terrifying possibility that he might already be too late. Ethan could negotiate billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, but standing in front of Claire now, he felt completely powerless. Her question still hung between them, sharp and devastating. If another man had not touched my hand tonight, would you have fought for me at all? Ethan looked at her and realized the terrifying truth was not that he lacked an answer. It was that he had spent so long suppressing his emotions that he no longer trusted himself to recognize them until he was about to lose everything. Claire watched the silence spread across his face and nodded faintly, like she finally understood something painful. That is what I thought, she whispered. She slipped the silver bracelet slowly back onto her wrist before turning toward the hallway leading to the guest rooms. Ethan reacted immediately. Where are you going? To sleep somewhere I do not feel invisible. The words hit him harder than any accusation could have. Claire, wait. She stopped but did not turn around. Ethan stared at her back for several long seconds before speaking again, his voice rougher now, less controlled. I do not know how to do this. Claire finally looked over her shoulder, confused. Ethan swallowed once. The relationship part. The honesty in his voice caught her completely off guard. Ethan Crawford was a man who dominated interviews, negotiations, entire industries. Yet right now he looked almost unrecognizable standing in the middle of the penthouse with uncertainty written all over his face. My father spent his entire life teaching me how to build an empire, Ethan continued quietly. He taught me how to win, how to survive pressure, how to never let emotions cloud judgment. His eyes drifted briefly toward the city skyline beyond the windows. But nobody ever taught me how to make someone feel loved. Claire's expression softened slightly despite herself, but the hurt inside her remained too deep to disappear that easily. That does not excuse 6 months, Ethan. I know. His answer came immediately this time. No defensiveness, no coldness, just exhaustion. Ethan slowly walked toward the dining table and looked down at the untouched plates still sitting there beneath the dim lights. One chair pulled out slightly, waiting for him. He stared at it for a long moment before quietly asking, You waited for me tonight, too? Claire folded her arms tighter around herself. I always waited. The confession shattered something inside him completely. Ethan suddenly remembered countless nights walking into the penthouse after midnight and finding lights still glowing softly in the living room. Blankets folded on the couch. Books left open beside untouched teacups. He always assumed the staff forgot to clean up. God, Claire had been waiting for him every single time. Ethan sat down slowly at the long dining table, rubbing one hand over his face as realization crashed into him piece by piece. I thought giving you this life was enough, he admitted quietly. The penthouse, the security, the foundation. I thought if I protected you financially, then eventually the rest would not matter. Claire looked at him sadly. I never married you for the apartment. Ethan finally lifted his eyes back to hers. Then why did you stay? The question came out almost broken. Claire hesitated before answering honestly. Because sometimes, when you forgot to be cold for a second, I saw the man you could become. Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully. Claire slowly stepped backward toward the hallway again, emotionally exhausted beyond words now. I cannot keep loving someone who only notices me when he is afraid another man will. Then she disappeared quietly down the hallway, leaving Ethan alone at the massive dining table staring at the untouched dinner his wife had prepared for him hours earlier, while the realization finally settled in that the loneliest person in the penthouse had never been him. The next morning, the Crawford penthouse felt unfamiliar to Ethan for the first time in years. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt empty. He stood alone near the kitchen island staring at the cold coffee in his hand, while sunlight spilled across the marble floors in pale gold streaks. Claire's side of the couch was perfectly folded. The blanket she always used was gone. So was the soft vanilla scent that usually lingered in the apartment every morning. Ethan had spent most of the night awake replaying every conversation from the past 6 months and realizing how many moments he had failed without even noticing. Around 8:30, he walked toward the dining room again and finally saw something he had overlooked countless times before. A small leather notebook resting near Claire's usual chair. Ethan hesitated before opening it. Inside were handwritten notes in Claire's neat script. Ethan's coffee before early meetings. No sugar after 7 p.m. Stress headaches after investor calls. Remind chef no shellfish because of his allergy. Tiny details. Tiny acts of care he had never even realized existed. Ethan slowly turned another page and froze completely. A list titled, Things That Make Ethan Smile. The list was painfully simple. Black coffee during thunderstorms. Jazz music when he cannot sleep. Late night drives downtown. Cinnamon pancakes from a diner in Brooklyn he used to visit with his mother before she died. Ethan sat down heavily in the chair, emotion tightening painfully in his chest. Claire had spent months learning him while he barely learned her at all. His phone buzzed suddenly against the table. A message from his assistant reminding him about the Crawford Foundation press conference scheduled for noon. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before standing abruptly. By 11:45, reporters filled the grand ballroom at the Crawford Foundation headquarters while cameras flashed beneath giant crystal chandeliers. Board members whispered nervously because Ethan Crawford was 20 minutes late, something that almost never happened. Then finally the ballroom doors opened. Ethan stepped inside wearing a dark charcoal suit, his expression calmer than usual but strangely emotional beneath the surface. Behind the crowd near the back of the room, Claire froze in shock. She had only come because one of the board members begged her to attend. She never expected Ethan to notice her there at all. But the second he entered the ballroom, his eyes found hers instantly. Every reporter in the room prepared for another business announcement. Another merger. Another billion-dollar expansion. Instead, Ethan walked directly to the podium and looked out across the silent crowd before speaking quietly into the microphone. For most of my life, I believed success meant building something powerful enough that nobody could ever hurt you. The room remained perfectly still. Ethan's eyes drifted toward Claire again. What I did not understand is that shutting people out does not protect you. It only guarantees you end up alone. Claire felt her breath catch softly. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and carefully pulled out the silver bracelet she had left beside the notebook that morning. There is a woman in this room who spent months loving me quietly while I treated her like part of the furniture in my own home. Several reporters exchanged stunned looks immediately. Ethan continued anyway. She waited for me every night. Defended me when I did not deserve it. Saw good in me long before I earned it. Then slowly, in front of the entire ballroom, Ethan stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward Claire. His voice softened when he finally stopped in front of her. You once asked if I would have fought for you if another man had not touched your hand. The room became completely silent. Ethan carefully took her trembling hand into his for the first time in months. I do not know if I would have understood my feelings in time, he admitted honestly. But I know this now. His eyes locked onto hers completely. I do not want another day of my life where you feel invisible beside me. Tears filled Claire's eyes as Ethan gently slid the silver bracelet back onto her wrist. Not because cameras were watching, not because people expected it, but because for the first time since their marriage began, Ethan Crawford finally looked at her like she was the most important thing in the room.